Thank you very much, Alex. That was a great presentation.
Yes.
All right.
All right, next I would like to call up Joseph Weinberg from Shift Network and Dina Mainville from CipherTrace. And as well, I will be moderating this panel. And the panel is on the FATF, Financial Action Task Force, and the travel rule directives that are bringing a lot of implications across the cryptocurrency industry and may shape the future of cryptocurrency trading. So this is very important to listen to. Welcome, you two.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Can you hear us okay?
Yes, you guys sound great. Okay. Just gonna mute Alex here. All right. So if we could kick off the conversation by just getting a brief overview, because this can get very technical for those that are not familiar with regulation and compliance and the way that cryptocurrency exchanges and VASPs, as we will define, need to work on the back end. Dina, maybe if you could start by explaining, what is the Financial Action Task Force? What is their job, and what is this travel rule that is now being implemented into the cryptocurrency industry?
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. So for anyone that's not familiar with the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, or the FATF, they are a global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog headquartered in Paris. So they're, I think, sometimes misunderstood to be a regulatory body. They, in fact, aren't. But the reality is that they set guidance that member countries are expected to follow. And the reality is that when there's an instance of non-compliance, generally the country at fault is either gray or blacklisted.
Great. And Joseph, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, maybe. Yeah. So, like the goal of FATF is, as Dina kind of said, to ensure that we can have a reduction in financial crimes. I would say that where this became meaningful to crypto was last year in June, when the FATF basically made, a requirement under guidance that basically stated that every country needed to add in the requirements that banks are traditionally bound by, which is the requirement to move identity information on behalf of all transacting users. So really in the same way that SWIFT works, FATF's requirement for crypto today is now that we have payment rails, we also need the ability to move personal information along with those. So that's kind of, I would say, where the biggest bulk of the requirement lands on us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely been, in the incubation of cryptocurrency, the trading has sort of been in the Wild West, and to reach that level of mainstream adoption, there's going to be some regulations, obviously, to protect the users, the exchanges, and their funds. And both of you are part of spearheading this initiative to bring eventually cryptocurrency trading into the mainstream. So it would be great if we could both get an explanation on Shift as well as CipherTrace, and the solutions that you're providing and how they relate to the travel rule being implemented into the cryptocurrency industry.
Joseph, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So we started Shift in 2017. The focus that we had really had was around solving problems that involve counterparties, really around how data is moved. So Shift is really designed for national identity systems, and really the problem that you're trying to solve in an identity environment is around how you trust your counterparty is, right? So if you have a government that needs to talk to a bank, that needs to talk to someone's personal information, how do you do that? And so that's really what our solution was designed on. It works on top of a public network that's secured by the Bitcoin network. It relies on smart contracts. And I would say that the main focus for what Shift was trying to solve in this solution wasn't so much around how data moves, but really more around how you solve counterparty identification, because that's actually the biggest problem in the space is how do I know if I'm Binance that, in fact, the other exchange on the other side is Coinbase, right, or someone else? And how do I know that, therefore, the wallet isn't held by any VASP? And so Shift has really been focused on more of discovery and coordination as really what we think to be the hardest problem, and then working with other companies like CipherTrace on kind of other parts of the solution. So.
Great.
Cool. Yeah, and for us, so CipherTrace began the travel rule information sharing architecture, which is what TRISA stands for. The sort of larger mandate is specifically around travel rule compliance without making modification to core blockchain protocols. So what we do is we've created a separate out-of-band mechanism to augment existing blockchains. So it's, I think, spirited well with the nature of crypto. It's an open source infrastructure capability, which means that it isn't owned by anybody. It's peer-to-peer. It doesn't require a centralized network. As I mentioned, its sort of mandate is to comply with FATF's new travel rule recommendations, and it leverages a bunch of existing technologies that are proven to work. So Joseph had already mentioned Swift. In that model, all transactions kind of go through a centralized hub. TRIS's approach is to have sort of a mesh infrastructure that instead connects virtual asset service providers directly to one another. We've got a peer-to-peer messaging structure. We've got a federated certificate authority that basically allows VASPs to obtain digital certificates to prove their identity. There's a whole model around revocation in case something goes wrong. Yeah, so we're very excited to be, I'm really excited that it's an open source protocol. We're doing a lot with the industry in general. And I think, one of the goals of meeting the travel rule requirement is really that level of interoperability.
Yeah, interoperability, especially in the blockchain industry, everyone needs to work together to create these common solutions. And I believe that CipherTrace is, you and Shift are working together to help spearhead this. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship and how the companies interact with each other?
Yeah, maybe I can kind of jump in on that. Yeah, so I think that there's a few core principles, right? I think the majority of solutions that, have a successfully bright future, I would say, and there will not be one of them, there'll definitely be a few, really comes down to how you interoperate at the data transmissioning level, I would say. And I think that that's a key consideration to a lot of projects in the next 6 months is, I think the last year has been really just figuring out what actually is required in order to make a solution properly work. And then I think the next phase, as we're connecting exchanges today, will really be the second question of how do we actually allow packets of data to move between a Shift validated exchange and someone that's working on TRISA. And so I would say, other than ideologies aside, where everyone is fairly, I think, aligned, I think the next question will be around how do you actually aggregate data across untrusted counterparties on both systems. And so that, I think, is where the majority of the work will be. I don't know if you have anything to add, Dina.
Yeah, I agree, Joseph. I think one of the one of the reasons why this is a highly contentious issue for the industry is because at the protocol level, these technologies just don't inherently capture the data that FATF is looking for, right? So there's been the need to build something that either you hard fork your way to getting the data into the blockchain, or you have to build some sort of data layer that sits atop and figure out how to transmit that data. So we absolutely are in agreement about that.
Great. And Dina, so this applies to VASPs, which is virtual assistant providers. Does that include primarily cryptocurrency exchanges, but also other wallets and counterparties?
Yeah, so I mean, it's the acronym is for virtual asset service providers. So you've got, companies that are doing issuance, custodial services, decentralized exchanges in some places. I think you might see this shake out differently, right? Because again, FATF is not a body that creates law. They instead set recommendations that are then later translated into local law in different member jurisdictions. So really anyone that's kind of a business in this space is likely someone that's going to fall under these types of requirements.
Mm-hmm. And I read that this applies, or as it says, it's not legally binding because it's not law yet, but it's mainly applying to the G20 countries and the mainstream countries that have a large financial system. A lot of cryptocurrency exchanges that come up in the United States obviously have tighter regulations than these overseas cryptocurrency exchanges that we're seeing that don't need KYC, or they only use cryptocurrencies. Does this apply to primarily to the major ones in North America and the developed countries, and what about those other cryptocurrency exchanges that are in offshore locations or smaller locations?
Joseph, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So this is a big, I don't want to say topic of debate, but discussion for enhanced coordination is the big questions today that we're trying to determine in the space is whether or not, well, first of all, what the definition of a VASP is, because that is extremely broad. And as you're saying, like, countries have a very different perspective on it. And I think it's probably one of the most interesting challenges that the space has today is that you're kind of having to say, well, first of all countries apply. So it doesn't matter if you're in the top 20 or the 36 or the 200, FATF requirements apply to you. How you choose to embed them into your regulatory legislative infrastructure is a different question, but they apply no matter what. And so that's like the first point. But the key consideration is whether or not you're a designated VASP. And I'll give an example. So in an example where I'm in a country that does not have full regulatory requirements, and let's say they don't occur for the next 5 years, but I'm a VASP and I still want to be compliant, what is the mandate? Am I allowed to be a part of these systems? Am I allowed to still transact? I'm not technically regulated, but I would probably still want to be able to transact with regulated entities, right? And so these are like the discussions that we're all trying to kind of figure out is like, what do the edge cases look like? But by far and wide, I would say that this applies to everyone. And the biggest exchanges that at least we're working with today, which would probably more than most fit into that where do you live question, are complying regardless of where they are. And so, I hope that answers questions or raises more, but.
Definitely.
Yeah, I would add to that, actually. I would say that while this is meant to be translated into law next month, you've got, like organizations like FinCEN who are saying that they've been doing travel rule since 2013, right? So we're finding that there's just this huge inefficiency when you're trying to compare different jurisdictions and how they're tackling this, or whether they have been, or whether in fact they've actually been enforcing any of this.
Yeah, well, implementing this into the exchange, I could imagine might take some resources, time and money. Is this, what are the implications for cryptocurrency exchanges that are looking to implement this? Is this a huge barrier to entry for smaller exchanges, and it's going to make it harder for, more of to increase the competition, and it's going to more consolidate the power into only the exchanges that can actually spend the time and money to implement these travel rules properly?
Maybe I'll the tactical initiatives, and then Joseph, you can maybe comment on the broad sort of industry outcome on this.
Yep.
So I think from a tactical perspective, the barrier to entry, it's not low, right? Like I remember when in New York they sort of came out with the bit license, and everyone sort of complained about how burdensome and arduous that was, and then they just moved business elsewhere. It's still not. It's not nothing, right? Like there's a whole laundry list of tactical guidance that's been provided, that encompasses registration and licensing, prohibitions against criminals or criminal affiliates owning or controlling the VASP in question, the assignment of a compliance officer, a slew of written policies and procedures, documented risk assessments, ongoing training. The list goes on and on. So I'd say the barrier to entry is certainly not low.
Yeah, and I would also say that, like, to Dina's point, like the reality is that if you were to fully comply, that would be a world that doesn't really exist today. Like the requirements for an exchange to be fully compliant, if you are, let's say, in the US and following every rule to the book, would probably, like what we think would increase the cost of doing business by probably 2 to 3 times what it is today. And
Wow.
so it also depends where you are, because of course that does change, but I would say that this is going to change the space pretty fundamentally. Like what we're noticing right now, even just like going through actual integrations of the system, is that there are so many questions that are so specific to every edge case you could imagine, whether there's a threshold limit. If I'm sending $1,000 in Singapore, it's $1,000 limit. In Canada, it's higher, right? And so how do you counteract the fact that every one of your counterparties all have different requirements? They all need to be balancing, their books effectively. And there'll be a ton of other questions that start to happen, right? And so I think what we're noticing now is that this already is increasing compliance costs by like at least 5 to 15%. But once you put it in, if you were to get the whole space into full mode, you'd look very similar to banks today, at least on the compliance side. Maybe less costs on the actual regulatory side, but your overall internal onboarding costs are very expensive. So I think that's just a reality, and I think that leads to consolidation. It just reduces the amount of competitiveness that you have naturally, and yeah, it adds a lot of unknown unknowns, which I think really is what we'll start seeing in the next years. Things that we don't really understand yet, how they'll start to take shape as a kind of reactive side effect to this as well.
Definitely. Well, 5 to 15% increase is one thing, but a 2 to 3x on full compliance and implementation obviously could take out a lot of players that are working month to month just trying to build a platform to add value to the space. So that's really interesting. We'll see how that plays out. Now, Joseph, both Shift and Teresa were in Paris in February at the Financial Action Task Force industry meeting. I know you were present there. Can you help the audience understand how international sentiment among governments and regulators is evolving throughout the digital space?
Yeah, so I can give like a bit of background too. So the way that the FATF has basically approached this, which I actually think is the right approach, is to cut out the noise, because crypto can be very noisy, but is to really try to work with 5 to 7 solution providers or VASPs, kind of in mixture, around a few different core concepts. One, education, because everyone here is still trying to learn. This is new to everyone, not just regulators, but us as well. To also really give a good level of degree or measurement around how successful we actually are in the process of getting this integrated. At the end of the day, like FATF and compliant countries what they're trying to do is monitor effectiveness. And so as much as they want to slap a bunch of regulations on you, it's also more about making sure that the things that they put in actually have, an upside and a return on the investment, if you will. And so that, I think, largely has been what the goal is. We meet every about 6 weeks. The goal is to give status reports and updates. At the meeting there that we had in person, which is probably the last one we'll do for a while, it was really good. We got a chance to kind of demo our solutions and really give them a good temperature as to where we think things are, and also really trying to give them information on what we think is feasible and non-feasible, right? Because people are talking about, well, do all non-custodial wallets in the space, would that go under regulation? And so that was the questions that they asked us, and us giving a very candid response and saying, these are the complexities, the difficulties, these are where we're going to see more issues down the road. And I think that relationship between industry and guidance writing is really, really critical. And I think that it's an interesting situation when you have one watchdog that represents the entire world, which is not normal to most of the regulatory requirements. So, yeah, it's a good relationship. Hopefully, we can continue to impress them. But yeah, that's kind of the lay of the land, at least.
Definitely. And Dina, what principles should we be thinking about as your ventures are tackling this issue and building out the solutions?
Yeah, well, so we're getting a bit of an echo. Some of the things that I think are important to both, the Teresa project, I think probably Shift would agree as well, is we want to maintain some of the principles that we all love about blockchains and Bitcoin specifically, right? Like, I think decentralization is really important. I think maintaining user privacy is important. And of course, that has a lot of complicated implications, right? Because you're again dealing with different jurisdictions who may have or have not enacted different laws around privacy and how they treat that. I think establishing and maintaining autonomy and sovereignty for the person, the user that's involved in the transaction is important. I think maintaining principles of inclusion is important. You know, there's an issue right now, right? Like our CEO likes to refer to this as the sunrise problem. What happens if there's a VASP in Canada that wants to engage with a VASP in a different part of the world who might not yet have these requirements or might not yet have found a way to comply? You know, you're excluding people from that financial model. And then of course, we don't want to break efficiencies, whether it's at the blockchain level or at the VASP level, right? These are businesses that are fully operational. And I think it's important that whatever we're building now doesn't completely break the workflows that they've already built.
Mm-hmm. And we're running out of time, but I really want to end on a positive note. And it'd be great if you both could give a vision of the upside of this, because it sounds like there's a lot of barriers to entry. You know, are exchanges going to be benefiting from this, and the users that are trading on exchanges and VASPs? You know, is there an upside where, you know, we're going to drive more institutional adoption, or cryptocurrency traders will see, you know, their personal privacy and data is more protected?
Yeah, I can speak a little. I mean, I think it depends on how you look at the space. I try to be optimistic and positive always, but yeah, I think that in many respects that what this is effectively doing is it's giving the regulated and traditional world a better ability to interact and integrate and interoperate. And I think that over the long term, depending on your view of crypto, that's a good thing. On the user side, I would say that there could be benefits. I would say non-direct benefits. In the short term, this is probably less beneficial to users than other, you know, services, in that you're opening up a lot of risk on security and data. But I think ultimately, if you can move to a system where you have identity as a base layer using these systems for new services, then it becomes really, really important. So I would say that, yeah, long term it looks brighter. Short term might be a bit, you know, interesting to navigate. But ultimately, yes, institutional adoption becomes a lot easier when you have a lot more transparency into how these systems work. And other bidirectional effects, like the SEC doing ETFs, might become possible as an offset to these types of systems. So.
That's
yeah,
great.
I think I would generally agree. I mean, I think regulation is always a touchy subject when you're in a very fast-moving and a space that innovates quickly. But I would say maybe the long-term prospect of crypto is positive when you've got regulated entities. Maybe from the consumer protection angle, there's a silver lining. And I suppose from an educational standpoint, this is, I think, probably for the benefit of the space in the long term.
Awesome. And we do have one audience question from Magdalena, and I'll sum it up with a couple of other questions that I had, and this will be the last question. Magdalena asks, does this travel rule affect second layer solutions like Lightning Network, as well as, you know, the travel rule applies to VASPs, but it doesn't necessarily apply to individual transactions, and also, you know, atomic swaps, decentralized exchanges, and not using VASPs to transfer funds. You know, does all of that sort of not apply, and it's really just for exchanges?
Do you want me to wait?
You can do it if you want.
Yeah, well, I mean, so yeah, the travel rule directives don't apply to individual users, which I think is a really positive thing in this space. The question about atomic swaps and Lightning, we get that all the time, and Joseph, maybe you'll have a different perspective, but as far as I know, it's really up to the different jurisdictions to figure out how they want to interpret those directives as they pertain to those two circumstances. And I'm not sure that I've really heard any conclusive evidence one way or another about how those types of transactions are going to be handled at this point in time.
Yeah, yeah, you're right, Dina. Like, it depends where you are. From what I remember was that if you're, let's say, in Europe and you're operating like a Lightning hub, then you are effectively under money transmission requirements. which is one of the big issues that people are trying to understand, because you're effectively acting as like a hub and spoke where you're helping direct funds on behalf of customers, or else hold them as in collateral. And so that one I think will be ever meandering, let's say, but primarily, at least today, like as Dina said, this is mainly only for companies, and hopefully we keep it that way. There's discussions about, you know, the next phase of this. I personally don't know how you do this on non-custodials with any effectiveness, but I guess we'll see how the future unfolds.
Yeah, definitely. And it looks like Kassem, the next speaker, is just fixing up his microphone, so we do have a couple more minutes here. I wanted to touch on the identity part because part of, you know, the cryptocurrency exchanges, anti-money laundering and KYC is having a proper digital identity, you know, and Shift does have that built into the system. Could you talk a little bit about how the identity part works as well, Joseph?
Yeah, so as like a independent solution, it's like secondary. So for like the travel rule, we're just trying to solve a database integration problem. Whereas on the identity, like the national identity side, that's a full-hearted identity, full-blown solution, I would say. Where it does get really interesting, and a lot of exchanges that we've been working with today are looking into this as to whether, because it's built in. So like the idea is that once you have a compliant address, let's say, an address which is a unique identification, you know, number, it's assigned to a user. That user is, you know, transacting in and out of an exchange for FATF compliance reasons. They're printing your KYC information against that unique identifier. It's not too hard to allow users to use that, i.e. port out that identity. And so where we think the future looks really bright is in the ability for users to autonomously control their wallets or control their identities using the exchanges as a distributed data infrastructure effectively. What that means is that you're basically saying, oh, we have to KYC all of our users, and flipping it into, well, hey, everyone, if you KYC with us, you're now getting an added service of having a fully decentralized identity that can be used for things like DeFi, for other types of DApp applications. And so trying to look at like not just the downsides, but where you can build positive, you know, upsides for everyone, I think is the next phase of this. But at the end of the day, if you can solve digital identity as it pertains to customer due diligence, you've pretty much solved the compliance issue in most respects. And I think that's something that regulators are fairly realizing of today, especially the Financial Action Task Force. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. Well, that's great. All the time that we have. Thank you so much, Joseph and Dina, for this exciting panel. And that's